Hello, everyone. So before I begin, I just want to take a moment to sort of introduce myself. Again, I am Sarah Kelly. I've just been with the museum for, gosh, a little over a month now, a month and a half. And I'm so excited to talk with you all today. Um, but I want to introduce myself not just so that you'll know a little bit about who I am and why I'm here talking with you today, but also so that you'll have a bit of context and understanding where I'm coming from, why I'm talking about Karen Karnes and her work in the way that I am. And I think this is a really important practice, especially as a curator, when we think about the objects and information that museums choose to tell, and to realize that this is a choice. I personally believe in many simultaneous truths and narratives, essentially dependent upon perspective. And that's really important to me when I think about how I portray a maker and their work. It's important to remember to talk about that being a choice rather than a singular fact or truth that an audience should take away from a conversation or an exhibition. I think it's more productive to know that every curator has a different background. Every person who experiences an exhibition or a conversation has a different background and will come away with a different opinion. And we should support that as a positive thing. I was raised and I'm speaking with you today from the land of the Cherokee, Tutelo, Saponi, and Catawba people, what is now called North Carolina. And I'm just on the edge of an area locally called the Piedmont, which is literally translates as the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. There are a lot of really rich narratives of craft in this area, and particularly of ceramics around this place, which is something that I became interested in as an undergraduate in college here. My formal concentration as an undergrad was in oil painting, but I was also taking courses in geology and religion and anthropology, which ended up a lot more closely relating, I felt, to my elective courses in ceramics. And my passion both for making and learning about ceramics was really growing at that time because of all of these other courses I was taking. Even though I went to a really tiny liberal arts school, we had an incredible kiln yard. We had sort of a mid-size, for any of you who are familiar, catenary arch wood kiln. We had a small downdraft train kiln that you could fire really basically in a short day. We had a soda kiln and a gas kiln. Students basically had the freedom to kind of experiment between the kilns. We'd put together a list of who wanted to fire what, and we'd get together and make it happen. And we also had the opportunity occasionally to collaborate with local potters in the area outside of our program. So going to areas close to here like Seagrove, North Carolina, which I'll talk about a little bit later. It's a community of potters here. Or take weekend trips to the mountains where there are also a ton of ceramic artists. The kind of community building and sort of group efforts to share knowledge and excitement that I experienced in those 2.5 years taking ceramics as electives was really something I had never experienced in any of my other art courses, or really in any other community in my life at that point. And I was totally hooked to the media, to the people, to the elements. I was taking weekend trips. This is revealing my nerdy self here. I was taking weekend trips to look at outcroppings with my geology professor. And that really taught me a lot about, some of the materials I was using in my ceramic work, how, these materials came into existence over millions of years of tectonic activity. It was so exciting to me then. And ceramics and geology just really, when they started to come together in this way, gave me a whole new worldview, and really helped me to see sort of a bigger picture of life and purpose and different kinds of community. So fast forward a couple of years, I'd worked as a studio assistant in a variety of clay and sculpture studios. I'd managed a winery. I spent a while at one of the craft schools in Appalachia, Vermont, if any of you are familiar. I was there for about 4 months. I worked for small arts businesses, both for-profit and nonprofit galleries, and I started to run a local craft fair here in North Carolina. All the while, my love of clay, has not wavered, and I was spending lots of times in studios and with artists, but by this time, I was making less and less of my own work. But as someone who spent, over a decade, sometimes working 2 and 3 jobs to make ends meet so that I could continue to make my own artwork, the way I started to look at the way people made work, especially in ceramics, was really impacted by some of the jobs that I had at this time, and really changed the way I was thinking about clay and working in clay. I had a lot more questions about the way popular cultures in America value certain kinds of artwork over others, about the cultivation of consumer habits and transactional expectations in retail environments, something I was seeing and hearing with sometimes blatant honesty working in retail craft spaces. And I started to think about how these things really directly impact to the way a potter can or has to live and work in order to make a living from their artwork. These are some of the questions that eventually led me to a graduate program in critical craft studies. It's a new program at Warren Wilson College in North Carolina. And essentially it trained me to ask critical questions of craft and of the structures and systems that support craft. My graduate project revolved around the cultural economies of clay and eventually led to an exhibition about clay in North Carolina. The exhibition was really meant as an addition to conversations about breaking perceptions of static regional borders and definitions of terms like local and traditional, basically using craft as a symbol and as tangible evidence of the inevitability of movement and change in the lives of both individuals, potters, makers, but also in broader cultural narratives over time. So I am going to now share my screen so you can see some of these beautiful pictures of Karen and her work. Let's see. All right, we full screen? Does that look good? Great. Awesome. So all of this over the last couple of weeks, looking really closely at the life and the work of Karen Karnes has brought me full circle with so many questions to craft, to consumers, to museums, to galleries, and to all of you who, of course, are taking your lunch break today with me and with the Museum and Ceramics Research Center. Thank you for that. And about this incredible woman who was both so far ahead of her time and also deeply connected to so many who came before her through her processes even, and her closest to the clay and the lifestyles that she created. She's often called a potter's potter. While of course this depends on an audience, how this kind of phrase is perceived, it can be incredibly complimentary among potters, sort of implying that those who know a material and the processes can closely recognize the skill and attention and proficiency displayed through the work. But it can also sort of imply, outside of a potter's context, that maybe an audience with differing material knowledge might not so much appreciate the subtlety and nuance of color and flame on a wood-fired pot, for example. I used to hear a lot in one of the galleries that I worked in, people would sometimes reference the brown pots. And yeah, sometimes wood-fired pots come out in varying shades of oranges and browns. And that's certainly not for everyone, but that's just to sort of speak a bit to the importance of the language that we use. But this is one of the ways in which I see Karen Karnes sort of transcending boundaries, not just of wood or salt firing practices and perceptions, but of pottery in general. Her work has such a stunning elegance. There's this quality of lift in her work, of motion, of sensuality even, that can help us potentially see how it was respected in so many different kinds of circles. She's a potter's potter, but something I'll talk about a bit more in a moment is that she was also very connected to this sort of avant-garde network in New York, sort of mid-century, in large part through her time at Black Mountain College, which I'll also talk about. So she's sharing thoughts and conversations and a lot of philosophical ideals with these people in some regards, yet she's not so much referred to in the same way as them at sometimes, like John Cage and Merce Cunningham, Robert Rauschenberg, even though they were all friends and spent quite a lot of time together. So I've been trying to remember lately when I first encountered the work of Karen Karnes. And as someone who was very interested in potters making functional and wood-fired work over the last decade of my life, I'm pretty embarrassed to admit that I think my first real memory where her work really sort of gave me pause, made me stop and think, was actually when I applied to graduate school. Part of our application involved discussing an object in depth. And we were given 2 objects to choose from for this sort of writing that we were doing. And actually both of those objects came from ASU's collection. So the photos that I saw then and what I was able to write about came from ASU's collection, which is really exciting, sort of a full circle moment for me lately. But what's funny now is that I actually did not choose Karen Karnes' piece. I chose the other object. So I thought I would share that with you. I thought that was a little bit funny. When I was going through the collection, I was like, oh my gosh, I know that piece. And I think I was sort of at a loss for words talking about her work then. So I hope I can do it justice now. So I just want to give you today one of many narratives and perspective of Karen Karnes' life. Sort of some big events and pivotal moments, I suppose. But I don't want to share these to imply that they were by any means the most important moments in her life, nor the only moments that were important for her. Of course, she is the only person who has the authority to know that for herself. But I'm sharing them because I think that they can help provide some context to her life, the time in which she was first receiving formal education in the arts, and then sort of learning ceramics on her own through practice and non-academic kinds of informal training. I think Karen said it best, and she's quoted as saying this a few times. There's a great documentary about her. There are no big leaps from no place. Every move forward is from where you are. And I think I would be really remiss to start talking about her life without sort of quoting those words of wisdom from her. I think this really says a lot about the way she chose to live her life, her sort of worldview, I suppose, the things that she was thinking about regularly as she made, and I would almost say sometimes in spite of how she felt. I say this because I think her approach to functional work and her socialist tendencies and interest in community living were really forefront to the core of who she was and what she felt mattered in the world. There were these occasions where she's kind of caught expressing a little bit of hesitation as to whether her work really mattered in the grand scheme of things, in a big picture of the world, whether they could make a difference or whether she should be doing something more directly considered, say, social work, perhaps, to make the world a better place. So let's look at some of those pivotal moments. And I just want to take a second to give a note of credit. A lot of the photos that I'm going to show you today are coming directly from the book that you can see here on the screen. This was a book published in conjunction with Karen Karnes' retrospective exhibition, which was curated here at ASU by Peter Held. And if you didn't see the show or are interested in reading more, the book is called A Chosen Path, The Ceramic Art of Karen Karnes. And it was edited both by Peter Held and Mark Shapiro. So Karen is born in 1925, and just a fun fact, I did not know this before this week, and I promise I didn't do this on purpose, but I just learned that her birthday was on Tuesday, November 17th. So happy birthday week to Karen Karnes. I was really excited about that when I found out. So she's born in the Bronx to Polish and Russian Jewish immigrants who were both garment factory workers and really heavily involved in union organizing in New York City. So this lifestyle, she sort of grew up in these union coops, as they call them, in the city, and was participating in a lot of union events and parades and gatherings. And her parents were really working hard labor in factories, and this sticks with her throughout her life and really impacts the way she lives her life. So what's going on in the US then? World War I has just ended in 1918. The country is experiencing a wave of anti-communism, sort of a first Red Scare, which really had to be present considering she was living in these sort of socialist co-ops in the city, had to at least be present in her parents' lives at that time. We have a lot more people living in cities than rural environments in the States at that time. There's jazz, there's nightlife, women are more commonly working outside of the home, and the 19th Amendment has just passed, so women just got the right to vote. Transportation is changing. More Americans are owning cars, and the country is experiencing a great migration of Blacks and African Americans from the Southeast primarily and into cities in the Northeast and the Midwest. And we have the Harlem Renaissance as really blooming at this time because of this relocation. And then also another huge event going on. So we have the Dust Bowl. So this is beginning sort of in the mid-20s. There are these massive dust storms in the central part of the country And part of that is and due to huge farming machinery and this sort of rise of mass agricultural practices. This really leads to devastation of the land and eventually sort of coincides with the Great Depression, which starts in 1929. In the late 1930s, Karen goes into the city. Her parents, of course, are at work, and she enrolls herself in the High School of Music and Art in Manhattan, and this begins her formal education in painting and drawing. She says she was already doing those things on her own, sort of partially as part of the offerings where she lived in the housing cooperative in Brooklyn with her parents. They actually offered art classes there, sort of another benefit of the living environment there. To put this time in a bit of context, this is sort of a WPA era. So there are lots of public art projects happening around the country, which are funded by the federal government. About 10,000 artists in various media and projects were paid during this time through government aid projects. And I have to confess, in the pandemic, I've been thinking about that quite a lot. I'll also note, I think something really significant, Eleanor Roosevelt during this time is really famously supportive of craft industries, sort of as an economic tool, especially in more rural environments in the 30s and in the 40s. And this is really visible here in North Carolina through some projects, but also across Appalachia in the Southeast and in textile industries. In ceramics, if any of you are familiar, maybe some of you own some pieces. In 1936, Fiesta Ware is launched in Pittsburgh, China and Glass Show. This is a company that was started in the mid 1800s, but this is a new line that they're just coming out with. And it's sort of based in Ohio and had expanded into West Virginia. And actually, I just found out it's still produced there, which I think is pretty cool. And in 1939, we have Russell Wright's American Modern Dinnerware line is released. This is released at a major department store in New York City. And we start to see here this concept of sort of good design, as they would call it, for the masses. This is really focused on a middle class market, sort of this concept of good design for everyone's home. There's this focus on, aesthetic in the home and supporting middle class values. This really lasts really through the 1950s and is a huge part of popular culture and sort of even government-funded advertising at sometimes. In 1942, Karen enrolls herself at Brooklyn College. So we're back in the war years at this time. So that's, I think, really, really significant to think about here. And why Brooklyn College? So Karnes is sort of famous for, giving this sort of nonchalant kind of perspective of her life, but she basically says, well, it's the obvious choice because it was the free public college and it was in my neighborhood. So it made practical sense to her to enroll here. It really paid off, though. There she studied with Sergei Shermanov, who was an architect trained in the Bauhaus style, and he taught primarily painting and drawing. So she's really here focusing on 2D work, again, painting and drawing, and sort of learning these formal qualities and things like that. She never really experienced clay or had access to it through most of her high school or her college training. And let's see, at this time, so December 1941, the US enters World War I after events at Pearl Harbor. Japanese Americans are sent to internment camps. That's huge. By 1942, Nazi Germany was at its peak. In pop culture, we have sort of swing and jazz and blues. Think Duke Ellington, B.B. King, Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby. And in the design world, in the mid to late 40s, Osamu Noguchi, Ray and Charles Eames, these are names that you'll see coming up pretty often in the design world at this time. Started a bit earlier, but certainly moving into this era. So fast forward to sort of the end of the 1940s, if you can think about all these things that are going on in the world, and then look at this image of this tent. So Karen Karnes, and who will soon become her husband, David Weinrib, are living in a tent in Pennsylvania outside of Stroudsburg. He's working there with a local clay factory designing things like lamp bases, sorry. And this is big because this is actually the first time that Karen really encounters clay in sort of a personal way. David actually brings home a lump of clay for her to work with, and this is really the first time that she works with it and kind of instantly falls in love. So while he's at work during the day, she's home and she's teaching herself how to work with clay. And actually, over that summer, they were there, I think, for just over a summer. The factory actually sees her work and decides to start paying her for her designs as well. And they were paying her $25 per design, she later says. This is someone who's literally just touched clay for the first time. And I really love that she talks about this time as they worked so hard for this long summer in Pennsylvania, which I'm sure was true. But essentially this funded them being able to move to Italy for over a year. So to kind of think about that for a perspective now, you definitely could not work for a summer and then go live in Italy for a year. I just think that's kind of fabulous. The image on the right that you see here is actually Karen later in her life looking at images of some of the designs that she created while she was in Pennsylvania. So just a little after that summer, around 1950, Karen and David moved to Italy. You can see here some lovely and sort of humorous depictions. These are, again, like the tent. These are drawings by David. And this is where Karen learns to throw on the wheel. So they're living in a small village outside of Florence. And she takes courses at this local village school that's essentially training locals to work in the ceramics factories there. So this is not an academic training in the way that we might think of getting a formal education in ceramics. She's sort of learning with her peers about how to throw on the wheel, sort of setting her up to work in a factory. But she was quickly recognized in Italy. She met the famed designer Gio Ponti, and he actually featured her work in his magazine, which was at the time really quite a big deal. And again, just thinking, you know, she's in her mid-20s and she's just started working with clay. So this is something that she made during that time. And I love this quote I have to read to you about this time in her life. She says, "I've learned to make pots outside of established patterns, but in the early years, David was there with advice and criticism. One can work alone, even in the beginning, if one has had a rich art background, visual experiences on which to make from, form judgments, a past of sensitive and careful looking." I think this is really important to how she defines herself throughout her career as a potter, the way she thinks of her practice, because she really is self-taught in ceramics in many ways. But she's totally guided by the principles and philosophies she learned in her more two-dimensional art training, both in high school and college. I think this is sort of what she's referring to here as established patterns, is what she says. This is 1950s when she's learning. So this is a time when there's a large move toward academic learning in universities. The GI Bill passed in 1944. There are a lot of veterans who are coming home from World War II, and they're enrolling in universities and taking art classes. I think Karen met a lot of those people along the way, but she's also surrounded by people who are trained artists in, you know, a variety of formal environments. At many critical moments of learning in her life, she's surrounded by really incredible and influential makers in all sorts of media: painters, other potters, designers, weavers, dancers, choreographers, poets. And I think this has really impacted the way she makes her work, and both the way she thought of herself and her work, kind of in relationship to her peers and what they were doing. So she did spend some time at Alfred University, which has a very well-known ceramics school. She was there through a fellowship. And it seems it was sort of an informal arrangement, but she got some great mentorship and learned some sort of technical aspects of production, firing kilns, glaze chemistry, that kind of thing that she was not learning as she was sort of self-taught. And she also got some critical feedback on her work at this time. But she decided not to pursue a master's degree there, which she could have easily done with, you know, maybe another year of study. And part of the reason for that was that she and David, her then partner, were offered a residency position at Black Mountain College in 1952. At this point, she's 27 years old. So for anyone who's not familiar, definitely check out Black Mountain College. There is a museum in Asheville, North Carolina. They have a great website and some really cool archives and things. Some of it you can access online. And they not just focus on the school, but also on the legacies of many of the artists who learned and taught there. So it was a tiny school in Black Mountain, North Carolina, in the mountains, which focused on an experimental style of pedagogy. Students were required to work for the school, and there was meant to be really sort of a community cooperative style of education and living. It existed officially from 1933 to 1957, so they're coming in really sort of at the end of this kind of era of Black Mountain. And just before Karnes and her partner arrive, there'd really been some major controversies and differences of opinion that inspired some really quite important faculty and students to leave the school. But when they arrived, there was this great pottery shop that was built by Robert Turner and Paul Williams. It was basically just empty. So ceramics was not really part of the technical coursework there. So essentially, they were neither students nor were they teachers, but they were just living and working there. They got really great affordable room and board. I think, she later says it was something like, $100 a month, and that was all their studio and all their living expenses. Their meals were paid for and that kind of thing. So they could really just focus on making pots, selling them, kind of building a market for themselves. But on top of this, big things happened for Karnes here. First, she spent time with MC Richards, John Cage, who was a composer, Merce Cunningham, who's a choreographer, and Molly Gregory, who at Black Mountain College was the head of the carpentry shop at the school. And this is sort of a big deal for a female at the time. So not only did she run the wood shop, but she also helped construct a lot of the buildings on campus with Paul Williams, who was an architect. And she also ran all the farm and the gardens there. I think this really impacted Karen Karnes coming to there to see this other woman in this role. So she was also able in this time to meet Shoji Hamada when he and Bernard Leach toured the US. They were hosted at Black Mountain College shortly after Karen arrived, and she really found Hamada's process and sort of state of being really hugely inspiring for the rest of her career. So she puts it so beautifully saying, his spirit entered me. She talks about the way he seemed to be so present in his work. He was teaching, but almost purely through quiet, sort of meditative demonstration, rather than by telling people in the workshop exactly what they should or should not be doing. She notes this quiet kind of thoughtfulness as he worked as being the most influential part of it for her. And as someone who is really known to be quite private, especially in her work throughout her life, could see how that really would have spoken to her. And these relationships really ended up being quite special to her and also led her to her next step with several friends, including MC Richards and John Cage and Paul Williams, when they moved to Williams's land outside of New York City in Stony Point, New York. So they moved around 1954. Stony Point was about 30 minutes or so outside of New York City. So it was close enough that they could all kind of pile into a car and head to the city for the day. And they would go and visit museums and go to cultural events and see galleries and things like that. But it was also far enough out and they had enough space there. I think it was somewhere around 100 acres, so pretty big, that they could really have some quiet and focus on their work. And I think this was important for Karen, who really valued and I think also needed this kind of quiet and solace to be the most creative that she could. This place was built up around their ideas. This is just a few people from the school who, had this idea and said, okay, let's go. We need a place to live and work. Let's make it happen. And they supposedly really built it rather inexpensively, which is a skill that Paul Williams kind of became known for at Black Mountain College. He built some of the big buildings on the campus at Black Mountain College. One of them, was something like $500 he ended up spending, which even then was, really, really inexpensive. So they kind of use these tactics and they're building this community here. So she ended up living and working there for 25 years. And so much happened for her here. It's really, really quite humbling to think about. So she and David had a child in 1956. And again, this community is called Gate Hill. But it was not long after that David decided he wanted to be in the city. He wanted to focus on his work on this sort of scene that was happening there. And again, thinking about her lifestyle, the way she identified herself as a potter, we can sort of think about what it might have meant for her to try to raise a child on her own in the 1950s and 60s, producing work that was relatable, usable, sellable, most importantly, but also something that she enjoyed making and found inspiration in. And I almost want to say kind of without a fuss. I think back to Hamada and his influence on her. She seemed to just sort of have this piece about the work she made through sort of focus and dedication. You really have to sell quite a lot of pots, as you can see in this picture here on the left that I love, which is her pot shop at Gatehill. But I don't get the impression, that this is something that she sat around and dwelled upon, oh, I have to make so many pots to feed my child. It was just something that she did, sort of without question. And I think that there were also other children at Gatehill. There's a lot of really great images of sort of community days and things that they had there. And I think there was quite a bit of support for her in that environment. A turn in her work occurred after she visited Penland, which is another craft school here in Appalachia and Western North Carolina. And she went to teach in 1967, which is actually something that she didn't do very often. When she was there, she was introduced to salt firing, something that really wasn't so much part of the contemporary palette for potters at this time, or at least maybe not in the circles that she was learning from and learning with. The kind of salt firing she was introduced to was something that not just through one exclusive path, but of course with many influences over time, was something the Germans did a lot of. Many who settled eventually in the Southeast and here in North Carolina, for example, carried on these practices. I mentioned Seagrove earlier. This is an area that's pretty close here in the Piedmont of North Carolina. There were a lot of German and English colonial settlers in the mid-1700s, and they actually moved to the Seagrove area because there was a huge clay deposit there. So that was kind of where they stayed. But they were using a lot of these salt glazes with local clays. So these are two wood and salt-fired pieces from what is now called Seagrove. So these are both by the Craven family, some of the first colonial potters to move to the area in the 1750s. This family continues actually to make salt-fired pots today in North Carolina. Donna Craven, if you're interested at all, is someone who makes these really quite large sculptural vessels that she fires in her salt kiln. But basically these pieces from the mid-1800s that you're looking at here were made with materials that were available. And the salt created a protective and also a nice looking glass surface on the pots, which were sold as storage containers generally and the like. These processes were passed on for many generations until potters here really began transforming their styles geared more toward tourist markets, sort of around the 1920s and 1930s. And again, thinking back to Eleanor Roosevelt in the 1930s and 40s, who was really promoting a lot of craft and tourism and economy in the Southeast. So this is kind of part of a sort of pop culture marketing almost. And Seagrove is definitely really influenced by that at that time. But also we have improved roads, trains, cars. A lot of new technologies are much more easily transportable, like glass. So a lot of these practices start to sort of fade out just a bit. It's not till really a few generations later that artists sort of revisit some of these techniques, and Karnes eventually becomes one of them. So what Karnes really finds in the salt glaze aesthetic was that not only did she really enjoy the surface, and you'll see there's you can see a little bit of similarity. There's what a lot of people refer to as sort of an orange peel kind of texture on the top that's happening, and that is directly from the salt in the kiln. And you can see that again here in Karnes's work. So she really loved what was happening with the surface, and she could really focus her energy on form rather than on decorating and on glazing. And this really was something that appealed to her. So essentially in a salt firing, you introduce the salt into the burning kiln at a certain time when it's really, really hot. It becomes gaseous in the atmosphere and actually clings to the pots, becoming part of the body of the work. So some potters will work with slips, which is essentially, in its simplest form, just a really thin, watery clay mixture that can either be applied to the surface of the pot by painting it on, or you can dip it on. But the clay of the pot can also be left as is, just as the clay body, and it'll be allowed to sort of be influenced by the salt in the kiln. which is much closer to Karen's approach. The color and tone of the pot with the salt will depend on what kind of clay you use. So for example, if there is a lot of iron present in the clay, it might come out to be a darker brown. If it's higher in other materials, it might come out more gray or more bluish. And then there's, of course, the possibility to introduce your choice materials, as Karen did a little later on. She was quite known for her cobalt blues, for example. And this is something that she could have had in raw material form. She could have made it into a glaze or a slip, or even just an oxide wash, and painted onto the pot before it was fired, and then what would have influenced what happened when it came out of the kiln. So around this time, this is sort of late 60s, she's also making her Flameware casserole dishes. And I'd love to know, either now or perhaps afterwards, and when we have a little bit of a conversation, if there's anyone that knows that if this is actually a Flameware piece, I would love to know that. Again, I've only been at ASU for several weeks now, and I haven't actually seen any of these pieces because I'm still in North Carolina. So if anyone here knows and can recognize this as a Flameware piece, or if it's not, I would love to know that afterwards. But I thought, just looking at the pieces that we have in the collection, I thought this looked most like it might be. It's sort of a reddish brown color that you can see the clay, and this is the kind of form that she was using with this Flameware. So this is something she started in the early 60s, and really made for most of her career for a couple of reasons. I think for one, as Mark Shapiro has said, these casseroles in some ways really speak to her working class background, and a desire to really create something functional, something sturdy that could be sort of multi-purpose for cooking on the stovetop or in the oven. These could actually be put directly on the stovetop. You could introduce the flame and they would, they were fine. So it was a really sort of trusty dish that you could reach out to regularly. But they were also so much more, because they provided essential income for her. These were actually pretty high dollar pieces for her early in her career. They were, I think she started them at like, $35, which in the 60s was quite a bit. And they're also really smartly designed and really beautiful. So I think she was proud these could sort of be an essential kitchen tool to a lot of people. And they were also something that you could cook in and then bring straight to the table as a serving dish. This technology behind this was sort of shared with Karnes when actually early at her time at Gatehill, the potters there were offered some free clay from a nearby mine in New Jersey. And it just so happened that the owner of that mine was an engineer. And he actually just taught them, he criticized them first. He criticized them for being sort of uninventive and not knowing enough technically about the material that they were working with. But then he taught them this Flameware recipe that he actually came up with. And Karen used it for quite some time. And actually this has been carried on by several potters who are still making it currently. So she really works with salt through the 1970s, as well as this Flameware clay, and for most of her time while she was at Gatehill. And that was, for any of you who might care to know, mostly in an oil burning downdraft kiln and a natural gas salt kiln at Gatehill. So these are a few more examples from ASU's collection that I think really exemplify this time in her career. It wasn't until she moved to Vermont with her then partner, Ann Stannard, who became her life partner, around 1979, that she really started working with various different types of wood firing. So she'd met Anne through kiln building, essentially, and I realized that is a simplification. That's a much longer story cut short. But they decided to leave Gatehill again in 1979, and they eventually built a large Bury box wood kiln at their new place in Vermont. And I put in this image anecdotally. So this is 20 cords of wood on this tractor trailer. That's a double tractor trailer load of wood. And keep in mind, that's taking up the whole bed lengthwise. So that's, I don't know how big a tractor trailer is, 10 feet wide or something like that. So quite big. So this is 20 cords of wood. I love that when Anne and Karen moved to Vermont, they immediately ordered 40 cords of wood. So that's twice this amount. And that's something they got as soon as they arrived so that they could start preparing for their year, both heating the spaces that they lived and worked in and also firing their kilns. And I just absolutely love the image of these two women moving way out to Vermont, and just the strength and endurance that would be required to sort of run this kind of homestead and studio life. So in the Bury box that they built, which is sort of an English style kiln that Anne, I think, was really familiar with, there are multiple fireboxes, and they built in a lot of space in the kiln, which essentially made it much easier to load and unload for the two women. You could really climb all the way in, and have two people lift a kiln shelf from either side to sort of stack the shelves and load the work in. Karen actually calls it back saving. And as a petite woman myself, who has spent plenty of time loading kilns to know the weight of a kiln shelf, I think it must have been a great relief, and a great idea. So you can see Karnes here, she's moving the shelves in her kiln, and this is a little bit later. This is around the 1990s in this image. But this is incredibly laborious work. But then, on the other side, this kiln could actually be fired in a day. It was a long day, but it could be fired in a day, whereas some styles of wood kilns, especially larger ones, can actually take several days of stoking. And that's a situation where you cannot leave the kiln, for multiple days at a time. So part of the reason for this was Karen's work had really gotten quite large. This started at Gate Hill. It wasn't really new for her. And whether this was just sort of the joy and path she found as she settled into a new market, she basically had sort of more confidence by this point that, she sort of knew that she was going to be able to sell her work. But she also just seemed to sort of allow this transition to happen over time, without really questioning where the work was coming from so much. There's one great line, and Lucy Phoenix made a great documentary about Karen Karnes. It's really beautiful if you have not seen it, where she's talking about her larger sculptural forms later in her career. And she kind of admits, Karen says, sort of stop myself every now and then, and I think, what am I doing? Because this is not, the use is not so direct as eating off it or cooking with it, which are the basic things one does with clay. She's also sort of quoted as saying, I began making bigger jars that you wouldn't really put anything in. And it went from being, oh, this is a honey pot, or this is a sugar pot, to, well, this is just a beautiful pot. You can do whatever you like with it. And I sort of love that thought. So here's an example of a covered jar that she made when she was in Vermont. This would have been something that she put in the wood kiln. And this is sort of a moment when she's experimenting with form and in function, and also the effects of a new wood kiln. There's these sort of beautiful, subtle changes in color around the piece, the oranges, the blues, the little bit of yellows. And this isn't a huge piece. I was just talking, her work was growing in size. This isn't huge. It's, I think, about 9 inches around on all sides or so. But it really speaks to this slow transition toward exploring new forms, but still grounded in something. She was really known to create a lot of jars. It's something that she made throughout her career in addition to the Flameware. So she's sort of playing with form, experimenting with new form, but also it's still grounded in something that she's made quite a bit of. So she's making different kinds of things. These pieces are a little bit older, late 60s, mid 70s. She's made these wonderful chairs and stools at different points. She made a fireplace, both of at which point were commissioned by her friend and another person from Black Mountain College, Jacqueline Orr Larson, who actually was a major textile designer for most of his life. So this is back in the 1950s. She's also creating these huge forms, plaster molds. I think this was going to be a bird bath. So this enlarging of her work isn't so much new, as you can see, there's quite a bit of timeline here, as it is sort of motion. It's an expansion of what she was creating on large scale, all the while. But she was sort of allowing herself to create these really organic forms without a clear plan or function, sort of letting them evolve as she built them. Really, in some ways, they speak to some of the forms I feel that she was hand building when she was actually first learning clay, when she was kind of teaching herself, both in Pennsylvania and when she was in Italy. When I look at this work, I almost see sort of a simultaneous, return to something, this sort of early creation, but also an expansion into new forms. And to me, this is just another reference to her ability for transcendence. I think this is true for really a lot of potters. You might be making a mug form on repeat, 50 times a day, 100 times a day if you're a production potter. But that's rarely to say you aren't thinking conceptually when you design that form, or that you aren't placing intention and conceptual thoughts into those creations. Nor does it mean the piece doesn't have utility in some kind of way. Utility doesn't have to be exclusively for eating or drinking or holding or storing. I think this was really true for Karnes, whose inspirations, I think, were really vast and multidimensional, but also intensely internal. This really becomes visible in pieces like this wood-fired piece, which is from later in the 90s. Also, like the one on the cover of the book, which I shared in the beginning, you can see lots more of those in her book, and we're in the retrospective, which is just really lovely. It seems to me like it took her kind of a long time for her to give herself credit, really, for the impact and magnitude of her work. As many of her peers, I talked earlier about how she, I think, seemed to sometimes compare herself to the work that her peers were making, or maybe the credit and attention they were getting. There was sort of this trendy art scene centered in New York mid-century. And these peers of hers, were getting credit for their avant-garde style and thinking, but Karnes was really right there with them. But she made functional pots for decades, and very strongly believed in the importance of those functional pots. She's quoted as saying at some point, she was sort of justifying her work as a maker, because she made work that people could use on a daily basis, that could maybe make their lives easier. Again, back to this sort of tool with the Flameware. It was sort of an essential kitchen tool. Once people found them, they would really fall in love with them. And I think that was important to her. But they were also really beautiful and provided beauty in people's homes. But behind those functional pots, was a person who was incredibly thoughtful, very intentional, and set such a wonderful example of the ways in which pottery really has the ability to imbue meaning and purpose and politic and concept, and even sensuality through these vessels of all kinds that she was creating. So I'm going to return to this winged vessel. There's two different ones here. One I've already showed you. And I think in honor of the labor and the research and friendship that Mark Shapiro developed with Karen Karnes, and because I know a lot of what I'm sharing today comes from this book that he and Peter Held worked so much on, I'm going to end this with a description of Karnes' winged vessels. And these two in particular are both, again, in our collection. So Mark Shapiro says, "To me, this work has this incredible quality of being neither pot nor sculpture, neither male nor female, neither landscape nor body. It has this very fluid identity that makes it really interesting and compelling for me." And I think I just want to leave you with that today as sort of food for thought. And I would love to open up to anyone who saw the retrospective and might have ideas or thoughts, anyone who wants to share any thoughts about the work or might have questions for me or about the work. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, we're opening up the floor, guys. Time for questions, comments, anything.
I'm just seeing Julio says he's always tempted to sit on the chairs. I just wanted to call him out on that. I think I would be too. So I'm just curious, is there anybody here that did see the retrospective or that's read the book and wants to make any comments, that anything that I might have left out, perhaps? Thanks, Dana.
So I'll just share. First of all, Sarah, that was Fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary Beth.
So I always said that my favorite exhibition, or the one that really left me with the impact, was Karen Karnes, for many reasons. That was the first exhibition that I worked with Peter from beginning to end. So it was also, it was the experience of the whole curatorial process, but also I was honored to meet Karen and Anne and Lucy Phoenix, who did the film of Karen. So I don't really have much to add. I think you covered a lot, but I just wanted to say that it was just amazing meeting her, and yeah, really getting to just sit down with her. And she was very, at least when she was at the exhibition, she was just very humble and very quiet, but yet powerful. So
Yeah, it seems that way to me. And if anyone's interested, that the documentary that I referenced by Lucy Phoenix is, I read, I got on Amazon because I was thinking, oh, can I buy this? And it was a little bit difficult, but I read the first review that I read, he called it slow. I instantly got really excited. I was like, oh, this is going to be great. And it was just so beautiful. And I thought that it really spoke to her personality and the way that she worked. And when I started to read about the influence that she felt from meeting Shoji Hamada, I thought it really made a lot of sense. It's just beautiful and yeah, so sort of slow and thoughtful. So I would highly recommend. I think, yeah, we do have a copy, Julio, and I do have it right now.
I was wondering, Sarah, and this has to do with the very beginning of what you were talking about. Just you use the word that you've explored this idea of value in maybe ceramics and other aspects of art. Could you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, and I wish I had any kind of answers or resolutions to those thoughts, and I don't. But I just would say that it's something that I continually think about, because value is such a cultural construct. Even putting a dollar amount on thing, it's not just inflation and what money's worth. It's also so culturally defined and built over such great amounts of time. These aren't things that happen in a week or a day or whatever. You can look at the stock market, and of course that whether or not you want to believe in that is fine, but these things happen over such a long amount of time. The way we culturally perceive things and understand things, and so much of that is political. And I think it's important to think about that as the value of a pot is totally political. And that's just something that I continue to sort of think about and hope to address more in my life.
Awesome. And then we have time for one more question. And Julio asks if you could quickly expand on salt kilns again.
Yeah, salt kilns are awesome. So this is when I get pretty nerdy, but when I first got into ceramics, I didn't realize how interested I was until I started firing wood kilns and salt kilns. So basically, it's just a process. It's just basically a sodium. So when you enter, usually it's when it's at a kiln is sort of at its highest temperature in the firing process, you'll introduce salt. And I mean, it can be, I think Karen was saying, something like 25 pounds of salt she was introducing. So it's a lot. So she's just putting in the raw clay into the kiln for the most part. Sometimes she was decorating them just a bit, but a lot of times it would just be the clay on the pot. And she puts them in the kiln, she loads them that way. So really the salt, becoming a gaseous state in the kiln is what's creating what looks like a glaze on the pot. So that's really just the salt being introduced and sort of sticking to the surface of those pots. It sort of becomes part of the material in that way. Does that help, Julio? Does that make sense? Great. And I will say too, there are different means. The sort of historic pots that I showed that are from North Carolina, those were fired in wood kilns with salt. So there are different processes, of course, that you can do that. I think Karen, for the most part, was firing either an oil or a natural gas kiln with salt. So there are different kind of processes you can choose there.
All right, if there are no other questions, thank you so much, Sarah, for your time, for your expertise, for giving us, as Dana said, all the juicy gossip and context. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, everybody else, for joining us as well. Again, we will not be meeting in December, so we will see you in January. Thank you for spending your lunch with us. Thank you for loving art, and thank you for having these conversations.
Thanks, everyone. Take good care.